It's crunch time. The USS Gerald R. Ford has arrived in the Caribbean, and thus we are looking at the first window in which the United States might stage, whatever the United States might stage. And because history loves to make things just a bit more interesting for us, the Ford's arrival comes as a trove of the Epstein files has been released to the public. For this reason, and a bunch of other reasons that we will get to later, there is much speculation that Trump is headed to Venezuela to create a distraction. And look, I even have the data to prove the public's interest in that question. So, today, we are going to discuss the possibility that Trump is trying to manufacture a rally round the flag effect. That is, initiate an unnecessary crisis for the purpose of raising his poll numbers. And to preview the answer, I do not want to pretend that I fully understand anything that happens with this administration. Maybe it is a classic diversionary war in the making. Or maybe we are just looking at a policy that Marco Rubio really wants to implement, and whether history will look approvingly on it remains to be seen. Either way, as a social scientist, I can say something a little more definitive. If the goal here is to capture a rally round the flag effect, it is a bad idea. Note that I am not making a claim about whether a military operation would be effective or not. That is a separate question for a separate video that you guys were a little bit less interested in, but I will nonetheless get to later. Regardless of whether the operation would succeed or not, I am saying that starting a conflict purely for some diversionary war type of reason is a politically unwise move. And the central problem is this square of squares, with one notable exception. But I am getting ahead of myself. The basic idea of a rally round the flag effect is that citizens want their countries to do well in times of legitimate international crisis. Sure, there may be plenty of political disagreements inside of a country, but we usually have common values on foreign affairs. If our country emerges victorious in a war, it benefits all of us. As such, you tend to see a surge in political support for leadership when a crisis begins, even from traditional political opponents. Citizens want to signal to the foreign opposition that they stand united with their government, and they will not let their domestic divisions get in the way of the military situation. Perhaps the best example of a rally round the flag effect began on September 11th, 2001. At the time, President George W. Bush's victory in the contentious 2000 presidential election was still on the minds of many Democrats. However, the United States was entering a period of crisis unseen since the Pearl Harbor attack and World War II. As a result, Bush's approval numbers surged to something implausibly high by today's standards, 92%. But the possibility of preferable polling percentages prompts the potential for perverse political practices. You can already see this playing out in the reporting on the crisis. Left-leaning sources tend to describe the actions taken so far as illegal and suggesting ulterior motives, whereas right-leaning outlets tend to focus on the pure military question. I know this thanks to some of the insights provided by the returning sponsor of today's video, Ground News. If you are like me, right now, you are probably struggling to keep up with the story. Well, fortunately, we can just click here, and with a few keys pressed, now Venezuela can remain on our news radar. All while Ground News continues to inform us of the subtle differences in how news organizations cover wars. And by going to ground.news/linesonmaps, or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take a fantastic 40% off a Vantage plan, which gives you access to all of the aggregated stories you can read about Venezuela, Ukraine, and beyond. So thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. But let's get back to the idea behind diversionary wars. Leaders like better poll numbers, and if an international crisis can improve poll numbers, then you get a temptation to manufacture an international crisis. Essentially, leaders can exploit an information asymmetry between the government and the general population. National security issues inherently come with a certain level of secrecy. For example, you cannot have a fully transparent intelligence service without divulging all of that information to your rivals and exposing your intelligence assets. Thus, it is possible for a leader to fool the public into believing that there is a legitimate national security threat, when the leader is really just fighting for personal gain. And it looks all the better when the war does not come at a direct personal cost to said leader. A classic example often cited as this mechanism at work is the 2003 Iraq War. Goodness, is George W. Bush working overtime for us in this video. The president wanted to keep riding his credentials in national security policy to re-election, and so his team inflated the evidence for the need for the war. Now, as a theoretical explanation for war, this is a logically valid argument. We normally draw the cost lines receding away from the expected outcome of the war. Because people die, stuff gets destroyed, economic investments go into unproductive sectors, and so forth. In other words, war is costly. That gives rise to the range of settlements mutually better than war. But if a leader gets direct benefits from fighting, then that is equivalent to a negative cost. In the extreme, no deal will be mutually satisfactory. A couple of important points here. 1. This is only guaranteed to be a problem for your average citizen if the leader has extreme benefits for war. When there are more moderate benefits, it forces the opposing state to make greater concessions. And that, perversely, is good for the citizens that have a biased leader. 2nd, things get more complicated when there is another bargaining friction at play. We have covered the issue with commitment problems in Venezuela before, so that should give us all some pause here about how Trump's possible personal bias might be beneficial. Basically, the private benefits make the leader more trigger-happy in the presence of another reason to fight, leading to additional cases where wars occur under conditions that the citizens would not like. As for what Trump's exact plan is here, the ongoing public speculation might be best described as a shotgun approach. Take your pick from a variety of explanations. There are the Epstein files, which the Trump administration has tried to keep tucked away, despite campaign indications that he would release them. A war in Venezuela would dominate the headlines. This might be helpful if you want the media to spend less time investigating the story. Look, news organizations have a limited bandwidth. If there is a war in Venezuela, they will spend more time using their White House sources to press for information about the conflict, not push against the Epstein files. Same goes with Congress. Goodness knows that there are a lot of people there, including Republicans, who wish that they could wrest more control from the executive branch. They are already frustrated with Trump not having congressional authorization to conduct the strikes on alleged cartel boats. This would send them over the edge, and the Epstein files would fall by the wayside. Think of this overall strategy as the latest iteration on the Trump administration flooding the zone. Side note, I think that social media's expectation on what may be in the Epstein files is raised a bit too high. There is a good argument that the files would not portray Trump in a positive light. Otherwise, the administration would just release them and move on. And the news that came out as I was writing this video indicates that the previous statement is spot on. However, to paraphrase a friend of mine, the smarter lawbreakers do not take notes on criminal fracking conspiracies. So it would be quite bizarre if the files contained explicit information on criminal acts that Trump may have engaged in, presupposing he engaged in any criminal acts in the first place. It is also hard to square how that information would exist, and yet no one has leaked it, despite Washington being a leaky place, the hypothetical information being incredibly salacious, and how plenty of politically polarized people would jump at the opportunity to reveal something like that, even at risk of personal exposure. Moving on to more mundane dimensions. Trump might also find utility in a diversion from the currently tenuous economic situation in the United States, with stock markets doing well as a consequence of speculation on AI, but simultaneously there being struggles within the working class, fears of a recession, lingering inflation, and potential rises in unemployment. Of course, the serious economic problems have not surfaced yet. So if Venezuela is intended to be a distraction here, then this would all have to be laying the groundwork for a serious diversion if those bad things started to happen. Then there are the more autocratic concerns, like wanting to place the National Guard in Washington, Chicago, and elsewhere. Or there is the grander scheme involving the Trump administration's alleged desire to suspend elections, even though the United States is not Ukraine, and there is no legal mechanism for that, even though there were still elections in the middle of a civil war a century and a half ago, and even though Trump is having a hard enough time getting the Supreme Court to go along with him on more mundane things like tariffs. Again, I cannot say that I know for sure what the Trump administration is thinking here. None of what I have said so far completely rules out the possibility of a diversion. But none of it rules out this being Marco Rubio's big project either. But what I can comment on as a social scientist is how effective a diversionary strategy might be. And there are quite a few reasons to think that it is a bad idea, with only one partial exception. As a starting point, we should discuss the mechanism by which diversionary war actually operates. We can divide Americans broadly into two groups: those who support Donald Trump and those who do not. Obviously, the goal of a diversionary war is to move some of those non-supporters into the supporters category. How that might happen, though, requires the introduction of a second dimension: whether you trust Donald Trump or not. Let's go back to Bush for a second. The rallies worked for him because this was still the dawn of the political polarization era in the United States. Sure, lots of people were angry with Bush v. Gore, but there was still some latent trust in the institution of the President of the United States. In other words, you might not have liked Bush much, but he was still the president, and the office of the president still commands a certain level of respect. So you might trust him even if you do not like him. Well, trust but don't like is the exact category of individuals that a diversionary war targets. Let's go back to that 2x2 grid. I know a lot of people who like and trust Trump. I know a lot of people who don't like and don't trust Trump. And I know a handful of people who like Trump but don't trust Trump. What I don't know are people who dislike Trump but still somehow trust Trump. Some of that is due to trends in political polarization, and some of that is specific to Trump. But when no one occupies this quadrant, there is nothing to be gained from a diversionary war. Actually, you risk people defecting from the like but don't trust category. Then there is the questionable target choice. Sure, Venezuela looks like an easy mark, and there is something to be said for punching down if you want to fabricate a crisis. However, the public argument for the need for military action in Venezuela is thin, focusing on cartel connections to the fentanyl trade. Some critics point to how Venezuelan fentanyl tends not to go to the United States, and so it does not make sense for Trump to focus military action there. Instead, he should target Mexico, which, let me check my notes here, is also something that he is discussing. A flaw in that argument, though, is that fentanyl is a globalized commodity, sadly not all that different from oil. Thus, if you crush a major distributor, other distributors will reroute some of their product to the now barren markets. In turn, if you destroy the cartels currently supplying the United States, other cartels will pick up some of the slack. Likewise, if you destroy the cartels not currently supplying the United States, supply to the United States will still drop. In that light, over the long run, you may be better off targeting the biggest or easiest cartel to dismantle, no matter where they currently supply. Instead, I think that the bigger problem with this argument is that there is no emergency here. Emergency implies urgency, but this has been a problem for more than a decade now. That is part of the reason why Americans have shrugged off the alleged cartel interdictions off the coast of South America. A good rally requires a true and urgent threat to the homeland. Remember, for Bush, even something as far-flung as Iraq still came with the specter of nuclear weapons. At present, Venezuela's only real threat to the American homeland is the possibility that Maduro has stashed away some Shahed drones and then points them at Florida. Now, that could turn into the drone equivalent of September 11th. Or it will just give some F-16s a fantastic opportunity to play target practice, with both live ammunition and live targets. And unlike the recent Russian incursions into Poland, there will be no concerns about collateral damage on the ground. It is open sea, and thus open season for the F-16s. Instead, if you really wanted to home bake a crisis, there are plenty of better options out there. For one, aiming toward China would already have the support of a large section of the national security establishment. Meanwhile, there is plenty of room to do something spicy with Russia. And I know that the first reaction that you would see to such a comment on social media is that the Trump administration would never do that because Trump is actively working with Putin. Well, no. The United States is still supplying weapons to Ukraine through the NATO Pearl Initiative. The United States had deployed the Ford to Norway to support Allied exercises there right before the Venezuelan shift. The United States has been supplying intelligence to Ukraine to allow Ukraine to engage in its immensely successful anti-oil and gas campaign. And the United States has recently imposed additional sanctions on Russian oil companies, which has resulted in a notable reduction in exports. That is actually another huge story right now that deserves a closer look, but other parts of life are interfering. Anyway, the whole Alaska summit stemmed in part from a misguided belief that Russia could be easily coerced into settling the war, and in part because Trump wanted political cover from having to take costly actions that might actually have some tangible effects. Judge that as you see fit. But that is different from working with Russia, as evidenced by the allegations that Trump grew frustrated with Putin turning the closed-door meeting in Alaska into a long reflection on the history of Russian security affairs. Point is, if Trump were really looking for a diversion, he could just scale things up in Ukraine. Putin would certainly respond with vague threats, but Russia is not in any position to truly engage the United States at the moment. And unlike Venezuela, there is now latent bipartisan support for such a policy. You might even get some of those individuals who are dubious, but not outright skeptical of Trump, to shift their opinion favorably. And a final reason why Venezuela would not be a good distraction is the timing. We are almost exactly a year away from the next round of consequential elections, but even those are merely midterms. The next presidential election, which will have a far bigger impact on the direction of the country, is not for another 3 years. Therefore, the political value of a diversion right now is low. If the war ends quickly, then whatever rally Trump gets from it will fade from the public consciousness well before the midterms. And if the war is still ongoing by the time that the midterms happen, then the diversion will have become a quagmire, a liability, not a benefit. The one caveat that I want to add here is that Venezuela, as a media and congressional distraction, might actually have some utility. And yep, we are back to Jeffrey Epstein. Again, the problem there is bandwidth. The start of a war would occupy all of the spare resources that media organizations and congressional offices have. And the kicker is that even a long war in Venezuela might not be the end of the world. If the media and congressional offices are squarely focused on the fighting, even if the fighting is bad for the Trump administration, if it is not as bad as what is in the files, it is still a win. But that still comes with the caveat that other diversionary options are out there and do not come with as much baggage on the trust issue as Venezuela. So, to conclude here, I do not know what the Trump administration has in mind with Venezuela. I do not know whether the United States will actually take serious military action in Venezuela. I do not know if Trump thinks that there is a valuable diversion to be had in Venezuela. But I do know that if a war begins in Venezuela, it will not make for a particularly good diversion. However, I do know a good thing when I see one, and 40% off a Ground News Vantage plan is just that. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take advantage of it. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.